What happens when the most powerful woman in tech loses everything in a single, ruthless boardroom coup, only to physically collapse into the arms of a desperate, grieving father? No cameras, no wealth, just a broken billionaire and a broke carpenter. This is the collision that changed two lives forever. Serafina Croft had not slept in 72 hours. At 34, she was the sole founder and CEO of Novus Dynamics, a multi-billion-dollar aerospace technology firm based in the heart of Seattle. She was a woman who dealt in satellite trajectories, defense contracts, and ruthless efficiency. Her life was an endless stream of glass-walled boardrooms, private flights, and calculated smiles. She was untouchable, or so she thought. The betrayal did not come from her competitors. It came from the man sitting to her right, Richard Langdon, her chief operating officer and the mentor who had guided her since she was a 20-something prodigy, had spent the last 14 months quietly orchestrating her ruin. It happened on a rainy Tuesday evening. Serafina had called an emergency board meeting to discuss a minor dip in their quarterly projections. Instead, she walked into a slaughter. Richard had secretly allied with Jonathan Pierce, her lead corporate counsel, to manipulate a loophole in her founder's equity agreement. They had manufactured a scandal involving offshore shell accounts Richard had opened under her name and presented the board with an ultimatum: remove Serafina immediately or face a federal investigation that would tank the company's stock. "It's nothing personal, Serafina," Richard had said, his voice as smooth and cold as polished marble, while the board members refused to meet her eyes. "You built a beautiful ship, but you're too erratic to steer it. We are relieving you of your duties, effective immediately. Security will escort you out." In the span of 20 minutes, her company, her fortune, and her entire identity was stripped away. She was handed a gag order and a legal threat that promised prison time if she spoke to the press. Panic, thick and suffocating, seized her throat. Serafina didn't go back to her penthouse. She knew the paparazzi and Richard's private fixers would be waiting there. Instead, she took the elevator to the basement garage, bypassed her chauffeured sedan, and found the old battered Honda Civic belonging to her junior assistant, a young woman who was currently on vacation. The keys were kept in a lockbox in the office for emergencies. This was an emergency. Serafina drove. She drove out of Seattle as the sky broke open, unleashing a torrential downpour. She had no destination, only a desperate primal need to escape the city that had just swallowed her whole. Her chest ached, her vision blurred. The windshield wipers beat a frantic rhythm against the glass, mirroring her racing heart. She was a billionaire who suddenly had nothing but the clothes on her back and a crushing, terrifying emptiness. 50 miles away, in the small, fading coastal town of Oak Haven, Thomas Hayes was covered in a fine layer of cherrywood sawdust. Thomas was a man built by hard labor and quiet sorrow. 2 years ago, he had been a moderately successful architect. Then his wife Claire was diagnosed with aggressive leukemia. Thomas had drained their savings, mortgaged their home, and sold his firm's partnership to pay for experimental treatments. It hadn't been enough. Claire passed away, leaving Thomas with a mountain of medical debt and their 4-year-old daughter, Lily. To survive, Thomas had retreated to Oak Haven, taking up his grandfather's old trade, woodworking. He repaired boats, built custom furniture, and fixed leaky roofs. He worked until his hands bled, fueled by the desperate need to keep a roof over Lily's head. But the walls were closing in. His landlord, a ruthless local property developer named Abigail Preston, had recently sold the entire commercial block to an anonymous corporate entity. The new owners were doubling the rent to force the tenants out, planning to bulldoze the historic street for luxury condos. Thomas was 3 months behind on rent. If he didn't have $5,000 by Friday, he and Lily would be on the street. The storm howling outside rattled the thin windows of his workshop. Thomas sat on a low wooden bench, a sanding block in his calloused hand, methodically smoothing the edge of a dining chair he hoped to sell by the weekend. In the corner of the shop, nestled in a makeshift bed of heavy-moving blankets. 6-year-old Lily was fast asleep, her small chest rising and falling softly. Thomas looked at his daughter, the exhaustion settling deep into his bones. He dropped the sanding block and buried his face in his hands. He was out of options. He was out of time. The Honda Civic died on a desolate stretch of highway 3 miles outside of Oakhaven. The engine sputtered, the dashboard lights flickered, and the car rolled to a pathetic halt on the gravel shoulder. Serafina slammed her hands against the steering wheel, the physical pain grounding her for only a second before the panic attack truly hit. It started as a tingling in her fingers, creeping up her arms until it wrapped tightly around her lungs. She couldn't breathe. The walls of the car felt like a coffin. She shoved the door open and stumbled out into the freezing rain. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer and soaked trousers, clothing meant for climate-controlled boardrooms, not a Pacific Northwest squaw. Within seconds, she was drenched to the bone. She began to walk, her designer heels sinking into the mud. She left the keys in the ignition. She didn't care. Let them take the car. Let them take it all. She walked for what felt like hours. The wind howled, whipping her wet hair across her face. Her mind fractured, replaying the smug look on Richard's face, the silence of the board, the sudden, terrifying realization that she was utterly alone in the world. She was hyperventilating, her breaths coming in short, agonizing gasps. Through the sheets of rain, a warm golden glow flickered in the distance. It was the only light on a dark industrial street. Serafina staggered toward it like a moth to a flame. It was a storefront with large, fogged-up glass windows. The sign above the door, barely hanging on its hinges, read, "Hayes Custom Woodwork." Serafina pushed the heavy wooden door open. The bell above it chimed weakly, barely audible over the storm. The air inside was warm, smelling fiercely of pine, dark coffee, and wood glue. Thomas looked up from his workbench, startled. Standing in the doorway was a woman who looked like she had just survived the shipwreck. Her expensive clothes were plastered to her skin, her hair a wild, soaked mess. But it was her eyes that made Thomas freeze. They were wide, dilated with sheer, animalistic terror. She was gasping for air, clutching her chest, her knees violently trembling. "Hey," Thomas said, his voice low, instinctively stepping away from his tools. "Miss, are you okay?" Serafina tried to speak, but her throat seized. The room began to spin. The scent of the sawdust, the warmth of the room, it was too much of a contrast to the freezing nightmare she had just walked out of. Her vision tunneled into a pinpoint of light. She choked out. Her legs gave way. She collapsed forward. Thomas moved with a speed born of pure instinct. He dove across the space between them, sliding onto his knees on the sawdust-covered floor. He caught her just as she went down, her momentum carrying them both backward, until Thomas was sitting on the floor, his back against the workbench, and Serafina was sprawled directly across his lap. She was thrashing weakly, trapped in the peak of a massive panic attack, her hands clawing at her own collar, as if trying to rip it open. "I'm dying," she sobbed, her voice a ragged, broken sound. "My heart, it's stopping." Thomas had seen this before. He had held his late wife through the terrifying anxieties of her illness. He knew the look of a mind turning on itself. He didn't ask questions, he didn't hesitate. He wrapped his strong, calloused hands around her trembling ones, gently pulling them away from her throat. He pulled her against his chest, locking her into a secure, grounding embrace. "You're not dying," Thomas murmured. His voice was a deep, resonant rumble against her back, a stark contrast to the howling wind outside. It was a quiet whisper, steady and unyielding. "You're having a panic attack. I've got you, and you are entirely safe." "I lost it." She wept uncontrollably, burying her face into the rough canvas of his work apron. "They took everything. It's all gone." Not brows. Listen to my voice." Thomas whispered, pressing one of his hands firmly against the center of her back, applying a deep, steady pressure. I want you to breathe with me. In for 4 seconds. Hold for 4. Out for 4. Do it with me. Serafina fought him at first, her body rigid, but Thomas didn't let go. He breathed loudly, exaggerating the sound so she could anchor onto it. Slowly, agonizingly, the rhythm began to take hold. "That's it," he whispered, resting his chin lightly on top of her wet hair. "Now, tell me 5 things you can see." I can't." "Look around the room. Just 5 things." "Wood," she gasped. "A saw." "A yellow mug. A window." She paused, taking a shuddering breath. "And a little girl." Thomas snapped his head up. Lily was awake, standing a few feet away, clutching her worn stuffed rabbit, watching them with wide, curious eyes. "It's okay, Bug," Thomas said softly to his daughter. "The lady just had a scare in the storm. We're just catching our breath." The presence of the child seemed to snap the last remaining threads of Serafina's panic. The adrenaline washed out of her, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. She suddenly realized she was draped across the lap of a complete stranger, soaking his clothes, shivering violently. She tried to pull away, her cheeks burning with humiliation. I'm so sorry. I don't know what happened. I'm sorry." "Don't apologize," Thomas said gently, helping her sit up but keeping a steadying hand on her arm. "I'm Thomas. That's Lily. What's your name?" Serafina opened her mouth to say her name, a name that was currently plastered across every financial news network in the country. A name that meant money, power, and now scandal. "Finn," she lied, her voice raspy. "My name is Finn." "Well, Finn," Thomas said, standing up and offering her his hand. "You're freezing and your car is clearly out of commission. You can dry off in the back office. We have a space heater and some terrible instant coffee." For the first time in her adult life, Serafina Croft had to rely entirely on the kindness of a stranger. She allowed Thomas to lead her into the cramped, messy back office. He handed her a stack of clean, oversized flannel shirts and a towel, and shut the door to give her privacy. When she emerged 20 minutes later, dry and wearing Thomas's plaid shirt that hung down to her knees, she found him sitting at a small kitchen table in the corner of the shop. 2 mugs of steaming coffee sat on the table. Lily was back asleep in her corner. "Better?" he asked, pushing a mug toward her. "Much," Serafina said, wrapping her hands around the warm ceramic. "I can't thank you enough. I was driving, and my car broke down, and I just—" "Bad day?" Thomas asked, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. "The worst of my life," she admitted, surprised by her own honesty. There was something about this man, his calm demeanor, the rough texture of his hands, the utter lack of judgment in his eyes that made her feel safe. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced since she was a child. "They happen," Thomas said softly, looking down at his coffee. "The trick is surviving to see the morning." They sat in comfortable silence as the storm raged outside. Serafina's eyes drifted around the small, cluttered office. It was a monument to a life of hard work and tight margins. Blueprints were pinned to the walls alongside faded photographs of a beautiful woman laughing with Thomas. Then her eyes landed on a stack of papers sitting on the edge of the desk. They were legal documents printed on thick, expensive paper. The top sheet was a notice of foreclosure and eviction. Serafina's heart, which had just finally settled, began to hammer against her ribs once more. At the top of the eviction notice, printed in a crisp, familiar, and terrifyingly cold font, was the corporate logo of the entity buying up the town. Aero Novice Land Management, a subsidiary of Novice Dynamics. Serafina felt the blood drain from her face. The man who had just caught her, who had breathed life back into her lungs, who was sharing his only heat and coffee with her, was being destroyed by her own company. Richard's aggressive expansion strategy was the boot currently crushing Thomas Hayes's throat. And to Thomas, Finn was just a lost traveler, unaware that the architect of his misery was sitting right across his table. The silence in the small back office was deafening. Serafina stared at the Novus Dynamics logo on the eviction notice, the crisp blue lettering blurring as tears of profound shame pricked her eyes. Aero Novus Land Management. It was a shell company. Richard had casually mentioned diversifying their real estate portfolio a year ago, but she had been too consumed with a multi-billion-dollar defense contract to scrutinize the details. Her blind trust had funded the destruction of towns like Oakhaven. Then, Thomas's voice broke through her spiraling thoughts. He was standing in the doorway, a look of mild concern on his rugged face. "You went pale. You sure you don't need a doctor?" "No," Serafina said quickly, forcing her eyes away from the paper. "I'm fine. Just a lingering wave of adrenaline." "Not," Thomas nodded, though his eyes remained sharp, studying her. "The storm is settling, but the roads are flooded out. The highway patrol won't get to your car until tomorrow at the earliest. There's a spare cot up in the loft above the shop. It's not the Ritz, but it's dry. You're welcome to stay the night." She should have said no. She should have found a landline, called her one trusted lawyer in New York, and begun the grueling process of fighting Richard. But looking at Thomas and hearing the soft, rhythmic breathing of little Lily from the corner, Serafina knew she couldn't leave. Not yet. She had brought this ruin to his doorstep. She had to be the one to dismantle it. "Thank you, Thomas," she said softly. "I would appreciate that." Over the next 3 days, Serafina Croft, the exiled queen of Silicon Valley, became Finn, the stranded traveler. She threw herself into the rhythm of the wood shop. While Thomas worked furiously to finish commissions, desperate to scrape together the $5,000 he needed by Friday, Serafina swept up cherrywood shavings, organized his chaotic ledger, and, to her own immense surprise, entertained Lily. She learned that Lily loved architectural models, a trait inherited from her father's past life. Serafina found herself sitting on the sawdust-covered floor, using wooden blocks and offcuts to build structurally sound mini-skyscrapers, explaining load-bearing walls and center of gravity to a rapt 6-year-old. The first time in a decade, Serafina's phone wasn't vibrating with urgent demands. Her mind, usually a battlefield of corporate strategy, found a strange, quiet peace in the smell of pine and the sound of Thomas's lathe. But the peace was an illusion. The clock was ticking toward Friday. On Wednesday night, after Thomas and Lily had gone to sleep, Serafina crept down to the office. She booted up Thomas's archaic desktop computer. It took 5 agonizing minutes to load a secure browser. She didn't contact a lawyer. Instead, she typed in a heavily encrypted email address belonging to Oliver Grant. Oliver was a brilliant, socially awkward forensic accountant at Novus Dynamics. 2 years ago, when Richard had tried to fire Oliver for refusing to fudge a minor tax report, Serafina had intervened, promoting Oliver and giving him a secure, untouchable position in the audit department. Oliver was fiercely loyal to the ledger and by extension to the woman who respected it. "Oliver," she typed, her fingers flying across the sticky keyboard. "It's S, sir. C. I'm safe. I need you to pull the shadow ledgers for Aero Novus Land Management. Follow the Oakhaven acquisitions. Look for the Cayman routing numbers Richard uses for his consulting firm. He didn't just steal my equity. He's embezzling company funds to buy up coastal land for a private data center, and he's using my name to do it. Dig, you have 48 hours." She hit send, erased the browser history, and sat back in the dark, her heart hammering. The trap was set. Now she just had to pray the jaws closed on Richard before they crushed Thomas. Thursday evening arrived with a heavy, suffocating dread. Thomas sat at the kitchen table counting a stack of rumpled bills. $3,200. It wasn't enough. Serafina watched him from the doorway, her chest tight. The exhaustion on his face was absolute. The fight had drained out of him, leaving only the raw, hollow look of a man who had failed his child. I'm going to lose it, Thomas whispered, not looking up from the money. I promised Claire I'd keep her safe. I promised I wouldn't let Lily lose her home, too. Serafina crossed the room and sat opposite him. She reached out, placing her soft, uncalloused hand over his rough, scarred one. You haven't failed her, Thomas. You are the strongest man I have ever met. Thomas looked up, his eyes blasé. You don't understand, Finn. The people buying this town. They don't negotiate. They're ghosts in corporate suits. Abigail Preston, the property manager, she told me the parent company is Novus Dynamics, a multi-billion-dollar tech conglomerate. How does a carpenter fight a billionaire? Sometimes, Serafina said, her voice dropping to a low, fierce whisper. Billionaires have blind spots. Sometimes they make mistakes, and sometimes they fall. He offered a sad, broken smile, squeezing her hand. You're a good friend, Finn. But tomorrow morning I have to pack up my life. Not. Serafina didn't sleep that night. She sat by the window in the loft, watching the moon reflect off the wet coastal roads, waiting for Friday. Friday morning dawned with the brutal, unforgiving clarity of an execution day. At exactly 9 a.m., a sleek black Mercedes SUV glided to a halt outside Hayes Custom Woodwork, its polished exterior an alien sight against the salt-weathered street. Inside the shop, Thomas stood rigidly behind his workbench, holding Lily's hand. Serafina lingered in the shadows of the back office, her arms crossed tight over the oversized flannel shirt she still wore. The front door chimed. Abigail Preston, the property developer, stepped inside wearing a predatory smile. Behind her was Bradley Walsh, a senior aggressive acquisitions attorney for Novus Dynamics. Serafina recognized his bespoke suit instantly. He was Richard Langdon's favorite attack dog. Good mornings to Hayes, Abigail chirped, her tone dripping with venomous sympathy. I see you haven't packed. This is going to be incredibly unpleasant for you. I have $3,000, Thomas said, his voice cracking with quiet desperation. I can get the rest by the end of the month. Please, Abigail, give me the weekend. This isn't a charity, Thomas, Abigail sighed, stepping aside. My client, Novus Dynamics, has the demolition permits ready. Mr. Walsh has the final eviction paperwork. You have 1 hour to vacate before I call the sheriff. Bradley Walsh unlatched his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of documents. Sign here, Mr. Hayes, acknowledging receipt of your eviction. Thomas reached out, his calloused hand trembling. Lily buried her face against his leg, whimpering softly. He's not signing anything. The voice cracked through the dusty air like a rifle shot. It wasn't the soft, trembling tone of Finn, the lost traveler. It was the absolute sub-zero authority of a Fortune 500 CEO. Thomas turned in confusion as Serafina stepped out of the shadows. Bradley Walsh froze. His eyes scanned the woman in the muddy boots and oversized flannel, finally locking onto her face. The blood instantly vanished from his cheeks. His jaw dropped. The expensive pen slipped from his fingers, clattering loudly onto the floorboards. Miss Croft, Bradley stammered, physically stumbling backward into Abigail. Bradley, what is wrong with you? Abigail snapped. Who is this? This, Serafina said, stalking toward them with terrifying, unyielding power, is a colossal mistake on your part, Bradley. And on Richard's. Thomas stared at her, his reality fracturing. Finn, what is he talking about? My name is Serafina Croft, she said, her eyes locked on the lawyer, though her words were meant for Thomas. I am the founder and CEO of Novus Dynamics. She finally glanced at Thomas, a flicker of desperate pleading in her eyes. I didn't know about this town, Thomas. I swear to you. She snapped her attention back to the lawyer. Check your phone, Bradley. You have an email from the SEC copying the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. Oliver Grant is a brilliant accountant. He found the command routing numbers. He found the paper trail proving Richard embezzled corporate funds to buy this land for an off-the-books server farm. The board has been briefed. Richard is currently in federal custody. She stepped within an inch of the terrified attorney. Novice Dynamics is abandoning the Oakhaven project immediately. The deeds are being transferred to the Historical Trust. Rip out that notice, get in your car, and leave. If I ever see your face again, I will personally ensure you die in federal prison. Do you understand? Yes, miss. Croft, Bradley choked out. He didn't retrieve his pen. He turned and fled, dragging a bewildered Abigail with him. The shop fell into a suffocating silence. Serafina turned to Thomas. There was no relief in his eyes, only a profound, devastating betrayal. He scooped Lily into his arms. "So, you're the ghost in the suit," Thomas whispered, his voice hollow. "You own the boot on my neck. It was all a lie." "Thomas, please," Serafina begged, her corporate armor shattering. "They stole my company. I was running for my life. I lied because I was terrified you'd throw me out. I stayed because I wanted to save you." "You saved the shop," Thomas said, stepping back to create an unbearable distance between them. "Thank you, Miss Croft. Your car was towed to 4th Street. You should go reclaim your empire." The dismissal cut deeper than any boardroom betrayal. Serafina swallowed her tears, nodded once, and walked out. 2 months later, Serafina sat in the Novus Dynamics boardroom. Richard was awaiting trial, the company was secure, and her power was absolute. But the glass penthouse felt like a tomb. She missed the smell of sawdust. She closed her laptop and walked away. The afternoon sun was bittering off the coast when she pulled up to Hayes Custom Woodwork. The shop had a fresh coat of paint. Inside, Thomas was working at his lathe. He stopped the machine as the bell chimed. She stood in the doorway wearing jeans, boots, and that same oversized flannel. "I bought a house down the road," Serafina said, her voice shaking. "It needs a new roof and new floors. I need a carpenter." Thomas stared at her, searching for the CEO, but only finding the woman he had caught in the dark. "You left your empire. I moved the headquarters. I can run it from here." She stepped closer. "I spent my life building a machine, Thomas, but I want to build something real. With you." The tension hung in the air until the guarded look in Thomas's eyes finally melted. He closed the distance, wrapping his rough hands around her waist, and pulled her against his chest. "You're safe here," Thomas whispered into her hair, just as he had on that stormy night. "I've got you." When a billionaire's empire crumbles, she finds her truest sanctuary in the most unexpected place, a humble woodshop and a single dad's embrace. True wealth isn't in the boardroom. It's in the people who catch us when we fall. Did Serafina make the right choice leaving her penthouse behind? Drop a like, share this incredible story with your friends, and hit subscribe for more unforgettable real-life drama.